This is a brief discussion about the distinction between educational and critical educational psychology. I've used these terms to basically frame this course. And I've argued that this course is intended to achieve two goals: introduce you to dominant ideas and theories in educational psychology, but also offer you a critical look at those dominant theories. And I'm calling that critical educational psychology. Now, there are some foundational assumptions that I would argue distinguish between these two perspectives. Educational psychology, I would say, is really intended to be declarative. And what I mean by that, it's intended to explain and describe among many things, right? But in particular, what we want to know is about students. How do students process information? How do they think? How do they remember? What affects those things? And how can we shape educational environments to, I guess, ideally affect those things? So it's declarative. It's about what is and what we can do. And oftentimes we think ed psychology, is unequivocally beneficial. It can be helpful for teaching and learning. And the more teachers know it, the more they should apply it. Another a guiding assumption or foundational assumptions or commitments are that educational psychology, it's neutral, it's value free, it's scientific, it's objective, and if we could just apply the theories well enough, then we can help shape educational environments for in ways to help students achieve their learning goals. And there's lots of different claims, right? So if you think about that, so if that's educational psychology, there's going to be certain claims, certain ideas, certain um, um, principles, objectives, models that we're going to see from that. So, for example, if you think about everything we've done so far, knowing students, right? So, ed psychologists would say they would believe that we could know students, and that the more you know them, the better as you can teach them. We might want to know how do they process information, how do they remember, and in particular, we might use the information processing theory to inform that perspective, how they remember, and then we'd use that to figure out how to teach them. If from an edge psych perspective, you're going to look at higher order thinking, for example, and say, hey, higher order thinking is good. It's unequivocally good. How can I better teach it? How can I better define it? How can I better measure it? How can I better integrate it into the classroom so that students can develop this better? I would argue that that is an educational psychology commitment, right? It's basically saying what things are, how we can go about teaching it better, how can we go about measuring it better and conceptualizing it better, and how we can, assuming that this is an unequivocally good thing for students. And so what I've also tried to show you is that some of these principles, ideas, theories, claims in ed psychology are also entangled in ideological, cultural, political, and historical contexts. And that these educational psychology theories, principles, etc., are not neutral and value free, but are actually entangled in those contexts. So, right, so the critical educational psychology commitment starts with that assumption that there is no such thing as neutral, value free psychological knowledge. They don't take as a starting commitment is that the better application or the more we apply at psychology, the better off everyone will be. There is almost like a starting point of skepticism. What is this? There's like the first question one might ask from a critical perspective is what's the ideological, political, and cultural context around this idea, this concept, principle, and how does this idea, theory, principle, how does it function within this context? What is it doing? What is it doing? And by that, right, let me give an example. So let's say with um, grit, for example. So how does grit function within schooling context? Well, if we think that grit is a neutral, value-free concept that describes students' commitment to long-term challenging goals, right? If we believe that there's this thing called grit, and it is what folks say it is, and that people have it or they don't, right? So what the psychology commitment says this, right? Grit is a thing. So we can measure it, we can observe it, we can teach it, we can cultivate it, and it is good. Well, from a critical ed psych perspective, it's they start with this with the belief that not there are no such thing as inherent categories to people. Any right, so any concept. So whenever we use language, right, we're using available language and concepts and tools to make sense of people, but they're not inherent categories of people. So grit is not an inherent category of persons. Harder thinking is not an inherent category of people's thinking. Growth mindset is not inherent. There's no such thing as an inherent category of people. But what we do is we use available language to interpret. We use certain things to interpret and lead to conclusions about what students are. So then now, so grit, and so if you thought about it that way, so grit, what does grit do? It functions to lead us to categorize people as having grit or not having grit. It functions to identify, and if grit is good, it functions to identify people who need an intervention versus people who don't, right? If you're gritty, you're fine. I could leave you alone, right? You're a good person, you have good character, right? You have the non-cognitive trait to be successful. If you don't have grit, then, right, I've identified you, there's something wrong with you, I need to fix you, I need to make you gritty in some way, I need to subject you to an intervention for grit. Right? And so grit functions to categorize people, which leads to deficit-based thinking. Someone has grit, someone does not have grit, which leads to interventions and how we can go about shaping people's character in certain ways so they can represent this ideal gritty being. Right? And so a lot of ed psychology concepts function in that way. Right? Because a lot of them are based on ideal representations of what people should be, how they should think, right? The kinds of character traits they should have. And so those are the two things I would say are two big commitments of critical ed psychology, right? Looking at the historical, political, and cultural and ideological context around educational psychology knowledge and claims, but also looking at the function. What do these things do? And so it's really important to think about what a critical ed psychology claim would be, right? So there's this skepticism that informs critical educational psychology. There's this attention to history, culture, politics, ideology. There's attention to the effects and consequences of believing ed psychology and applying ed psychology. So let me give an example of a critical educational psychology claim. And we could go thinking about knowing students. So a critical ed psychology claim about knowing students, if we think about function, okay, so what is the function of knowing students? So one might say, from a critical ed psychology perspective, the reason why one might want to know students, right, is so they can use that knowledge to try to connect the curriculum to them to help to generate buy-in to the curriculum. And that seems like a really great thing, right? Just at the surface, it's awesome. Yes, we should connect what we're doing in class to what students know, right? But then you could say, well, then you might, right? So then you might add on to that and say, well, then the purpose of knowing students is to use that knowledge to render them adaptable and amenable to an existing educational setting and structure, right? So the curriculum stays the same, classroom stays the same, stays as is, but let me know you and use that knowledge so I can get you to buy into this, right? So you can adapt to that context. Right. So Freire might argue, right? If we go back to Freire, Freire says, hey, anytime people, like students, for example, are changed so they can adapt to a context, right? That um, the interest of the oppressor is to get people to change themselves to adapt to a context. Because critical theorists start off with the assumption that schooling can be oppressive and marginalizing spaces. And if students are just led to adapt to those oppressive and marginalizing spaces, we're helping to reproduce those oppressive and marginalizing spaces. We're getting people to change themselves to fit within those oppressive spaces. Where Freire says, hey, people should always be engaging in dialogue to challenge those oppressive spaces, to renegotiate and negotiate them, and to help to create better structures and practices in ways to help to mitigate inequality and promote social justice for everybody. And that can happen within sort of these micro contexts and sort of these macro contexts. All right, so critical claim might be that right, knowing students is used to try to generate conformity, adaptability, right, to institutional settings, right? So to render students adaptable to those settings that might be structured, might be oppressive structures. So that's speaking to the function of knowing students, right? So the function of students, and that's speaking it from a critical perspective, from a critical way. Because someone could easily see that as really good and say, hey, well, this educational environment's great. There's no oppressive structures here. It's wonderful. It's awesome. It's actually, it's the greatest thing. There's no there's no dehumanization. There's no oppression, and getting them to adapt to the schooling thing is for their own good, right? And people would believe that. Um, Critical theorists tend to be a little more skeptical and saying, hey, schooling historically and even contemporarily um, has been discriminatory, dehumanizing for certain people in certain contexts. And again, if we're trying to get folks to adapt to those contexts without challenging those contexts, right, they'd say that's dehumanizing, that's oppressive. So whenever you're thinking about critical ed psychology, always thinking about function, but but you should always think about that function in terms of consequences on students, consequences on social systems and structures. Think about also think about the historical, political, cultural context, right? So that critical perspective is always going to speak to issues of power, culture, politics, philosophy, and ideology.